Okay. Okay. Good. Hi everyone. Welcome to Kitaabi Cabins. मेरा नाम वाणी है and this is another one of our Thursday sessions and thumbnail I'm pretty certain everyone must have seen by now. Today we have one. Today we have a very special guest. She probably owns the most I don't know why I'm fumbling all of a sudden. She runs my most favorite Instagram handle. And I was telling her before we just started, I was telling her, Abhi, ki I think hers are the only posts that I genuinely like because I want her content to stay on top of my feed. And that was it. And DG Verma is here. I'm sorry, DG. We were just chatting away and I kind of had to confess my love for her Instagram handle, and so I just kept on pushing it. But hi everyone, and I hope you guys will find this conversation a tad more interesting. If you're joining right now, do like the stream, and the more you like the stream, the more it gets recommended to people. And as you have been noticing on Thursdays, I'm trying to get an individual who is very well read and can recommend the best of books for us to read. So, Utkarsh, hi, how are you? Guys, do like this stream. And yeah, and without wasting further time, let's just. Okay, wait. Ayan is here. Hi, Ayan. I think, you know what? I'm going to wait 2 more minutes for people to join in before I call on the guest. And yes, if you do not follow her already on Instagram, like I've told in several of my streams, do follow her handle. It's in the description below, and you will absolutely fall in love with literature, words, poetry, and everything that's in store. I'm just quickly going to check if her Insta handle is in the description. But how is everyone doing? How is the Thursday evening going for you? Cool. Anjit is here as well. Here to like the stream. Thanks, Anjit. Do share it with your friends also. And without wasting further time, let's just jump right in. So I'm going to call on Trivarna Hariharan. And she actually runs the handle by her own name, which is Trivarna Hariharan. Absolutely wonderful place if you love snippets, if you love quotes, if you love poetry, and if you love reading in any case, and if you would like to get into reading as well. So, hi Trivarna, you can please turn on your video and audio. It'll be absolutely amazing. Hi, how are you?
Thank you for that incredibly kind introduction, first of all. Such a delight to be here chatting with you.
Nice.
And hello to all your viewers and all your followers and subscribers. Such a delight.
Thank you so much. You know, I was very excited for this week. Of course, unfortunately, we kind of got into scheduling, rescheduling, and like the time difference and everything. But I was very excited for the stream, and I absolutely love your Instagram handle, and I do not know how to stop telling you that. But how do you curate the quotes and snippets? Do you have like a special notes section? Do you take notes of it, or do you just how do you plan your content and posts?
So it's a combination of planning and kind of allowing myself to be led by what I'm feeling at the moment. Because that's always been a huge part of my journey as a reader. I tend to lean towards books that express what I'm feeling at the moment, or words that express what I'm feeling at the moment, but may not be able to articulate myself. So there's a great deal of that that factors into my curation. So it's kind of like a mirror into the stuff that I want to say myself, perhaps. So I always think of writers as a collective, right? I mean, of course, there's also the individualistic aspect of an artist, the artist as a single individual. But I think what's equally important is to acknowledge the fact that all of us exist in a collective umbrella, and we reflect and echo off each other. Think of it as an endless series of echoes, one voice to another. And the more echoes there are, the more resonant it gets. And so I've always thought of writers as a constellation. I keep saying this. And so it kind of, in a way, naturally comes to me to think of one writer in terms of another. So if I'm thinking of Virginia Woolf, I'm thinking of Sylvia Plath, I'm thinking of Anais Nin. And the things that they've said over different periods of time. I mean, there may not be much in common in terms of the biographical context. I mean, if you take Virginia Woolf and Eunice D'Souza, for instance, completely different in their voice, in their time, in their styles, everything. But somehow, to be able to find that one thread of connection, it's almost like igniting a spark of communication between people who are no longer alive. Almost, it's a magical experience, and to be able to find threads of communication between writers spanning across different periods, it's almost like they're talking to each other, and that's so powerful. It's almost, I get the feeling of kind of reawakening them in a certain sense. So I always been interested in the dialogue. So if you notice my handle, it's a series of quotes or words or on one particular theme, grief or hunger or resistance, whatever it may be. I'm interested by the ways in which different people have articulated their emotions on a similar subject, and the ways in which that seems to spark a dialogue between different voices. That's really powerful, because that's the one thing that I think keeps society running, is dialogue.
Nice. And how do you maintain this archive? How do you decide that this is what I'm going to post and this is what goes along? I know, like, you've read a lot, you're very well read, and there are so many quotes in your memory. But how do you? There's an art to, I think, archiving as well, where you know where you need to go in order to obtain a particular emotion, and quotes are just context related to that particular topic.
So there's this thing called common placing. What happens is that you essentially maintain a journal of all the quotes that have stayed with you over a period of time. And that collection is not ordered, actually. It's entirely unordered, which is to say that, I could have two quotes or two excerpts on completely different topics in a single page. And I kind of do this very instinctively on a very regular basis. If I like something, whether it's in a journal or a magazine or a book, I immediately excerpt it either on my phone or I write it down in a journal, citing, of course, the author's name and the book's name and so on and so forth. And I do not order this. So that's another thing. I like for it to be unordered, so that when I go back to this commonplace book, I find sudden sparks of surprise in the ways in which two authors you would have otherwise never expected to be speaking to each other, actually speaking to each other. And that's very interesting. So I purposely keep it unordered and unlabeled, and so that makes it more interesting in a sense, instead of just kind of saying, let me search for quotes on loneliness per se, but to have a book that's entirely sort of unlabeled in that sense, and to be able to suddenly see that there are two authors who seem to be speaking about loneliness, but in very different ways. And I think that can only come from not kind of maneuvering it, or not kind of ordering it too deliberately. And the other thing is that an author need not speak about a certain subject directly for him or her to be expressing what he or she feels about it. There may be overt expressions of loneliness, and then there may be this image of a queer man sitting alone in his room, drinking, waiting for his love. I mean, he's not expressing loneliness in literal words, but it's all there for you to feel in the structure and the landscape that he's created. Richard Sykin does this beautifully, I think, in all of his poems are about the violence of loneliness, almost. Loneliness, about how piercing loneliness can feel. It's a very physical, visceral feeling, and it can crack through you. It's numbing and visceral and violent at the same time. So I like for it to be unordered, so that I can sift through my commonplace book. My archive is my commonplace book, and to kind of see the different ways in which people are speaking on the same subject.
Right. And I have a very stupid question now. Like, do you know what you're going to post? Like, until when? Like, so if do you have a content calendar? So,
No.
do you wake up every morning and you decide this is what I'm going to post?
In terms of like maybe a week ahead, or 3 4
Got it.
days ahead, but definitely not for a month ahead or some such, because I think that there are certain things that I don't want to schedule and plan, and important, so one of the things about art that I find so fascinating is that it's timeless, but it's also urgent, which is to say that it's born of hunger, anger. If I may briefly touch upon what we're going to speak about, it's so instinctive, and it's so based on the moment and on the spur of the moment, which is why a lot of the pieces that I like may not be correct, quote unquote correct in the literal sense of the term. And so, for instance, when without obviously naming the event, because that would warrant a different conversation, uh, things panned out in the United States of America a certain way for women. There were protests. I was incredibly angry. I was also feeling helpless at the time, and this wasn't planned at all, but I went to my archive, my commonplace book, and I sifted through it for hours and hours, and there were so many quotes that stood out to me by women, um, that expressed exactly what I was feeling, and also somehow the inability to articulate the rage that is so unfathomable. Because a lot of writing is also about the inability to articulate what you actually want to say. And so that's how that came about. I think I curated that pretty much the same day, if I'm not wrong, 2 hours
Yes.
before or something like
Yeah.
that. It was very urgent. It felt urgent to me, and I think that that's important. So yeah, there is a mixture of planning, and I also keep myself open to being led by what I'm feeling.
Nice. And so I will jump right to the topic because you just mentioned the word rage, and there was this quote that I read once when I was growing up, and perhaps you can tell me who said it because I don't remember at all who actually spoke those words. But somebody had said, art is supposed to comfort the discomforted and discomfort the people who are very much at rest or maybe too comfortable. And I think I have experienced that in terms of a lot of emotions, especially grief, romance, love. There are a lot of emotions that we've explored, but somehow every time I think of the word rage and anger, I do not know why, but there are not many examples that come to mind. And I don't know if there is a reason for that. Perhaps I was just exposed to books that have not touched upon that emotion that well. But do you have certain recommendations in terms of if you're looking to perhaps connect with somebody who's a very angry character, or a place where you can find refuge in somebody just experiencing a lot of rage? Do you have certain reference points for that?
Yes, and very different ones. And so the thing about anger is that it's such a complex emotion to express in terms of writing, because writing is a process of translating thought to language. So that itself is a certain act of distancing. You need a certain distance to be able to translate something that's abstract into something that's concrete, also keeping then the readers in mind. So it's a hall of mirrors already. And anger is such a spur of the moment, instinctive, visceral feeling, that it makes it that much more tricky to articulate it through distance, right? Because then, are we really expressing anger, or are we expressing our reflection on the moments in which we were angry?
True.
So that's the first question. But I think that can also be very powerful, because sometimes anger expressed just as it is can be destructive. It can actually be self-defeating and counterproductive, because anger can be a very infectious emotion. I mean, protests are based on some amount of rage, at least. A lot of very powerful revolutions, movements have been based on a solidarity of rage. But it can bounce back. It can deflect on itself if it's expressed in an aggressive or a passive aggressive way. It can crack through itself, essentially. And so it's important to have a certain distance between the anger and the articulation of it in writing, I feel. And that anyway is it happens by default, because writing is a time-taking process. You're going to go back to edit it. So you're going to be reflecting and contemplating about that. And not all kinds of anger are right also. There's also that aspect. There may be things that one says in anger that one did not mean at all, or that can actually go against the kernel of what one was actually meaning to do, etc. So it's a very complex emotion, essentially. And so the writers who have expressed it best, according to me, are the ones that have done it through tragicomedy, through satire, through modes, through craft.
Okay.
Anger as expressed, Hamlet, actually, Shakespeare's Hamlet, can be read as a story about anger, and the ways in which anger actually leads to inaction. How very dichotomous, if you think about it. The need for revenge, the need to be angry on somebody who's allegedly killed your father, leading to inaction. How does that happen? It happens through contemplation. It happens through craft, and so there's that. So there's this wonderful book besides Hamlet. I'll be talking about Hamlet later, but there's this. I want to specially focus on Black writers, brown writers, and indigenous writers. Because I think that also certain kinds of anger over the years have been privileged over other angers. Male anger has always been more legitimate than female anger, for instance.
Okay.
Women, I read this really interesting quote recently. Someone said that, anger is just unresolved grief or something like that. I do think that that's true on one level, but I also feel like anger is an emotion of its own. Let's not start connecting it to other emotions and say that this is unresolved grief or this is unresolved loneliness, etc. No, because then you're kind of snatching away the legitimacy of an emotion that can stand so powerfully on its
But
own.
don't you think those are also sometimes the roots of anger? The moment you actually go on to resolving, say, perhaps a loneliness or, um, say, a moment of grief, you kind of feel calmer after that. The moment you get closure, you see your anger fade away.
Yes, so that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is that, when you connect anger to other emotions, you kind of snatch away the legitimacy of a person to simply be angry, and that itself can be pretty powerful. We don't often allow, anger is also a very shameful emotion. You feel very exposed in your vulnerability almost when you're angry, which is why a lot of people say that I don't take it out on other. It's anyway not right to take it out on other people. I go into my room and I, scream into something, or I have this box. So like a lot of people do that, and so it's a very private emotion, also ironically. But I think that allowing ourselves to feel the anger itself in itself can be very cathartic. Just sitting with that emotion and letting it take over you in an almost meditative way, to allow yourself to be in the intensity of it, and to allow it then to pass through you. Because when you allow yourself to sit in the intensity of an emotion, it invariably passes through you after a certain point. Can't stay for very long after that. So wholly accepting it without connecting it to something else can also be equally powerful, I feel. And I say this with specific reference to female anger, because uh, you know there's this tendency to kind of think of women's tears as weapons, and lots of people have written about this over the years. Lots of women writers written about this.
True.
There's this sense, and this also weird sense of, the fact that women use anger in women is almost evil. It's like something that needs to be cured, uprooted. And and so that's why it becomes more important to give that emotion a certain sense of legitimacy, especially in women, especially in brown and
I'm sorry, that was my Alexa. Sorry. Please
no,
go. Please.
yeah, in brown women and black women. uh, you know uh, uh, there's a sense that women are weaponizing their anger somehow, which is not true. It may be true in some cases, but just allow, sometimes I feel like the reason for anger is not allowing yourself to feel the anger,
True.
or suppressing that itself can be a reason for anger.
You know, a few days ago, when you told me that women and tears, they're just considered, the tears of women are actually treated as if, we're pulling out weapons and knives. And somebody a few weeks ago actually told me, so I don't say everyone is like that, but there are certain people who have, um, so we grow up learning a few things and we still don't unlearn them when we are old enough. And a certain old lady came up to me a few weeks ago and she told me, you know what, I don't feel bad when girls cry because, we are made sensitive and everything. But the moment I see a boy crying, I know he feels deeply. I know he's well brought up. And I'm like, something really is wrong. I was and in that moment I felt really angry but of course I don't do anything about it because I knew like there's no point arguing here, she's not going to listen. But yes, I kind of agree with how you say um, that women and tears are like the tears of women are treated like weapons, like they're weaponizing the thing. The conversation now is going to turn into her favor because here come the tears.
So even if she's angry, she must not be really angry. She's using her anger as the means to an end. That's a
Because
very,
she's sensitive. It's
yeah, she's hysterical, and she's using her. Either she's destabilized, so that's another end of
yeah.
the spectrum, or she's using her anger as the means to an end. She's not really angry, even when she may be absolutely angry and have every reason for her anger. So that is important, and that's why the legend and Leslie Jamison. So yeah, I'm coming to my first recommendation here. Leslie Jamison, in her non-fiction work, writes. She has this essay called "I used to insist that I don't get angry. I don't do that anymore."
Oh wow.
What a wonderful title, right? And so, I've been identifying with that feeling so much. No, I am angry. I'm going to be honest about the fact that I am angry. And so, to offer legitimacy to that emotion as a singular emotion is, I think, the first step. Um, and now coming back to what I was speaking earlier about craft and black anger, brown anger, especially. Um, so there's this book we read in our MA called Invisible Man by Ralph Allison. And it's a book about this black man's journey, this unnamed protagonist's journey through racism, through intense physical, emotional abuse, through discrimination. And it's a book that does not talk about anger in very direct ways. It's the kind of book that, but is founded on the bedrock of anger. You know, uh, the narrative molds it in that way. And so there's something also very powerful about a writer not calling a thing by its name, but by demonstrating in every step and action what he's actually feeling inside. And the fact that, again, Black people so often don't feel and aren't made to feel like they can be angry. There's a certain kind of, again, delegitimization there. And so he very Ralph Ellison, the author, uses satire to construct his narrative. There are lots of moments in the novel in which the narrator looks at him. So it's a first person narrative, right? So you'd assume that it's like within his head, then it's the inside looking at the outside and all of that. There are very genius moments in the novel where the narrator sees himself literally from the outside. It's like the mirror reflection looking back at the actual person in flesh and cave. And he looks at himself with a great deal of um, uh, with wide open eyes, because it's important to realize sometimes that especially when you belong from a marginalized group, that it's certain kinds of discriminations are so ingrained in yourself that you actually start performing them to yourself without even realizing that you're marginalizing yourself in a society that's already marginalizing you or othering you. And this person, I won't give away the plot, but this man has actually been othering his own self all along in various ways. And so that moment of outsiderness, of looking at himself as a mirror into himself, is such a powerful moment of the tone is almost derisive and mocking. And it comes definitely from a place of rage. It's almost like, what are you doing to yourself? Wake up to yourself and wake up in your own skin. That's craftful, that's distance, and that's anger that's channelized through distance. And so that made me realize that anger can also be a tool of self-reflection. Of course, it's also a tool of, like I said, catalyzing movements, collectives, etc. But anger can also be used as a way of looking into yourself, of thinking about the things that you've been doing wrong, perhaps, because there's a very it pairs you open in a certain sense. It has, very ripping quality to it, the emotion of anger. So the narrator telling himself that he's actually been, doing the entirely wrong things that he was not supposed to do, things that are actually acting against. And I'm just summarizing it, but he says it in very visceral language, which you'll get when you read the book. That's anger. And that's anger used as a tool of clarification and of self-reflection. That's powerful. And of course, it's also turned outside. It's turned upon, it's turned upon his own community, actually. There are lots of things that I don't want to, because I'll give away too much of the plot and then take away from the reading experience. But, it is a real trajectory. So starting off by being marginalized, then this phase of self-reflection, and then finally moving on to laughing at the world. Laughter, nobody would think, can actually be an expression of anger. It's weird, but a lot of people, and I think comics will tell you this, a lot of comic sketches come from a place of anger, come from a place of discontent, as they say. Comedy is a great place to put your anger, because it can hold it. The lightness of it can hold the weight of anger. And so being able to laugh, at the world, and being able to mock it, being able to bring it down, actually comes from a place of deep anger. He does that very effectively through the, I think, latter half of the novel. So there's that. So Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, for sure. Okay. Other book, yeah. You want to say something?
No, I was just taking note. The Invisible Man.
The Invisible Man. The other book, again, now it's very different from this one, is Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. A lot of people have already read it. Have you read it?
Sorry, which book?
Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels.
Yes, I have. And that's why I was a little surprised.
Yeah. So, that's usually prescribed as children's fiction or something like that. Yes. I discovered. It was a bit weird to me, because I rediscovered that novel. It was literally eye-opening when I read it in college. We read this in BA. And most of our conversations were about anger. Like, how is this children's fiction? Especially towards the latter half of in fact, the fourth chapter, the fourth section, of the book.
Right.
So fun, not fun trivia, but trivia nevertheless. Jonathan Swift's epitaph reads Siva indignatio, which means savage indignation,
Okay.
which again is an expression of anger. Is almost expressing a brutal kind of savage indignation, and I think that is a running thought in Gulliver's Travels, especially towards the latter half of the book. It's disillusionment. So for all those who may have read the novel, the first two sections start off with him being in awe of this world that he's going to be exploring, discovering. But every single illusion that he had about his own world, and this, of course, is a meta comment on, well, his own country. So, is ripped off. Literally every, it's a comment on monarchy. It's a comment on political structures. It's a comment on the ways in which political structures manipulate their power. And so, over the course of the novel, his narrator, realize Gulliver and gullible, actually, there was a word play there. We kept discussing that also. Keeps realizing that everything that he's known about his own world is actually a sham, and that leads to near madness. In fact, it leads to madness. And so I'm very curious about the relationship between madness and anger as well, and madness not as negative actually, but madness as someone who has the ability to stare right in the eye of the most disturbing truth. That can be maddening, and madness and enlightenment are actually very close to each other in terms in the spectrum actually. And so and there's I think there's a portion in which he goes on a complete quote unquote rant about, there are paragraphs and paragraphs about the ways in which lawyers misuse their power, about of course this is not to make broad statements about particular professions in general, not at all, but about specific instances of abuse, about untruth, about the ways in which law, which is supposed to be well, we witnessed that very recently, the courts, etc., passing judgments like these that are in anything but the favor of humanity, and of basic human rights, literally. And Gulliver does it at that time. He actually compares. There's one line in which he lists so many different professions, right from king to lawyer, then he goes down to prostitute, to thief, to murderer. So all of these are listed in one line, as though they were all one and the same. He keeps conflating what is supposed to be high language and what is supposed to be low language, and there's a great deal of satire, physical humor, etc., and every disillusionment kind of comes to fore, one after the other. And at the end, I think he almost admits that he's at such a point of breakdown that he wants to have nothing to do with humanity. He says, I want to become a horse, because I think the Hoyan hymns represented the horse, the equine, if I'm not wrong. And so there's this want almost to break into another body. That's the level of anger he's at, anger as transformative almost. So that's another aspect to anger. Anger as the tool with which you transform yourself, break through your own body into almost a very transcendent kind of otherness, and then be able to look back at your own society, at the fallings of your own society. So Gulliver's Travels is another one.
I have a few follow-up questions, and one of them is personal, and you can choose not to answer it as well. Do you remember the first time that you got angry in your life?
Yes, I do.
Would you like to share it with us, or?
Well, yes, pretty tricky. in terms of, like, I won't go into the details of it, but there was an instance of physical abuse that I remember very clearly, in my school, when I was, I think, in the first standard. That's like the earliest memory I have. I don't know if I was angry ever before that. I may have been. But there was an instance of physical abuse for something that I hadn't done at all. It was unfair. I knew it. I couldn't retaliate, obviously. Of the 5-6 year old can't. I felt helpless and I felt angry. I also felt very aggrieved, and so it was a mix of a lot of emotions, and it was not knowing where to put the anger, actually. Or I think it helps also when you can sort of, it's like it's so different. The anger is also so different, right? It's so different being angry at a friend about something bad they may have said. You can always bring it up. You can always communicate. There are certain kinds of anger that cannot be communicated, because of the power imbalance, the power dynamic, and those kinds of anger I find very difficult to deal with. That's when I turn to art, I think. And so I think that's my earliest memory of feeling very angry, of recognizing the power imbalance, of knowing that I wouldn't be able of anger, I think, also of knowing that there is an unbridgeable gap here. There was the anger of the incident, but also of knowing, perhaps at some level, that there will be certain kinds of anger about which you will be able to do nothing. It was also compounded by that.
Right. And you also said that anger sometimes can be transformative. But towards the end of your answer right now, you also said there are certain types of angers where you realize that I won't be able to do anything about it. And I don't know about you, but that is the time when I really. So, my anger, and like we discussed, anger is a very private emotion, and perhaps this is also a lot to do with the kind of society we were brought up in. We are embarrassed by our anger. We do not like to be angry in public. We are very private about it, and I'm a very private individual that way. The moment I get angry, I do not speak to people, because the moment I start interacting, I am afraid it'll just be a bad burst of emotions. um, but yeah, so sometimes when I realize this anger cannot do anything and it's just going to be downhill from here, and it is not going to be fruitful as well, I think I tend to go inside my shell. And of course, that moment of hopelessness, like when you do not see, like, hey, I'm angry, and I believe it's right of me to be angry, but nobody's seeing my point, and no, they cannot understand. Have you figured out how to deal with it? And do you okay, my first question would be, do you experience something similar, and if so, have you learned how to deal with it?
When you are really angry and you realize that nobody around is seeing it or is able to see it, and perhaps you yourself are a barrier there because you don't want to see anybody. You don't want anybody to see you in that moment.
True.
Well, yes, it has happened. It does happen. Actually, that's the kind of anger that I tend to experience more often than anger that I think I can, kind of communicate, etc. Those kinds of anger are slightly easier to deal with. But that's my personal take. But again, I think, is it Natalie Diaz? She said, "Let me be lonely but not invisible," or something along the lines of that. And I just, it was so resonant. I needed it at that moment, and I found it. I think I've also posted it. I get that. It can be almost debilitating, actually, because it takes you back to something very primal, which is a lack of mirroring, which is a lack of emotional psychological mirroring, to be more precise. And I say primal because we need mirroring the most when we're children, especially when we're infants. It's when our elders teach us how to laugh, how to cry, or they speak to us, they make all those gestures, that we then begin to mirror them. We mirror the words, etc. It's a very primal emotion, the need to be mirrored and the need to feel mirrored. It's a complete, it's a very fulfilling, completing feeling. And it can be a very, very powerful gesture. But so many people do not have that. So many people do not have the privilege of being mirrored, and that can make you feel invisible. And invisibility is hurtful and wounding precisely because it makes a dent on your singularity. How do you establish a skill? And singularity is something that's of utmost importance, I think, to any individual. The fact that they're unique, which is what makes them feel that they're indispensable, that they mean something in this world. That's your anchor in this world. The fact that I'm a singular individual, and feeling feeling invisible can make serious dents on your singularity. It can make you feel that you do not matter, or that you matter lesser. So that, I think, is I think perhaps the most difficult emotion in this particular context to deal with. What I do to deal with it, I can't claim to be very adept at dealing with it, or I allow myself to feel a lot of those emotions. I allow those ghosts to pass through me. Like I often
Right,
keep,
absolutely.
yeah, that's my line. Let them pass through me, and let me try and be a good host while they're here.
It's interesting you said, like some of us experience childhood. We don't, there's lack of emotional mirroring. And it's funny, like, because a few weeks ago, my therapist actually told me about this term called emotional neglect. He said and a lot of us go through it and we don't realize it. And then it comes out in terms of people trying to please others. And us trying to get attention of everyone who we genuinely really like and want to trust and want to be friends with. And I think I think one of the many reasons why people are afraid of being angry is sometimes rooted in that emotional neglect that they experience in their childhood.
Oh, absolutely. The fear of abandonment, the fear that if you express, also the that yeah, you brought up something important there. The fear at your core that you may not be accepted in your entirety. Like that's a big one for a lot of people. They
True.
feel like there are certain aspects of them that are very likable and desirable for which they will be accepted, but there are certain aspects they should keep hidden because this could possibly tamper the relationships that which is a very it's self-destructive, because if someone loves you only conditionally and only for certain aspects, that's not a holistic love. you know
True.
that's conditional love, and that will be like a self-fulfilling prophecy that will feed into precisely the lack of emotional mirroring that one may have had in childhood, being adored for certain things and then being neglected for certain, so that it doesn't work like that. So anger, grief, these tend to be emotional. A lot of depressed people strangely feel this way, like they are somehow burdened. They're somehow burdening other people with their very presence,
True.
because they're feeling um, aggrieved, or they are or they don't feel like others, or they don't feel as happy. And so there's also this aspect that that you will be loved only if you're a certain kind of person, or only if you're quote unquote on all the time, which is not at all true. I mean, why should you be on all the time? You should be loved as much for your vulnerabilities as for your talents, as for your skills, as for your intelligence, etc.
I just think as individuals we take a lot of time realizing it.
I
And
think
like right now I'm in what my mid 20s, and now I'm realizing like, hey, there's no necessity to be insecure about this particular aspect of your life. And there are other things that I'm genuinely very insecure about, but I think slowly when you realize there is no need for it, slowly when you start surrounding yourself with people that matter and people who truly see you for who you are, and even if you do not have people like that in life, sometimes you just make pockets that kind of give you and offer you the security that you need.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah, that's very important. Yeah,
Yeah.
the other thing is to, of course, not surround yourself with people who compound, feelings of self neglect, of anything that may be self destructive. On your second question of how I deal with it, I think again going back to art, I find it extremely, extremely comforting. It's almost like that's also the beauty of art, is that it's like a wound that opens when you least expected it to. And I say wound because it's both something that's painful, but it's also something that can be the foundation of intimacy between two people. And so these writers come alive for me, as I go back, going back to anger, Sylvia Plath again. I mean, she expressed, look at a poem like Daddy, of, having the courage to express her anger at the neglect and the abuse that she faced at the hands of her father. It takes a lot to speak against your own father in public. It takes a lot, especially at that time. She did it. Of various other things. I go back to Virginia Woolf. And the other, I don't know how many of your viewers are writers, so I'm sure there are, but there's this one poetry prompt that came up in one of our workshops, which is to write a letter to someone who does not yet exist, which I find very powerful. A poem written as a letter to someone who does not. So first, what you have to do is you have to imagine this person. So there are multiple layers to this. You imagine almost like an empathetic witness of a place, of a person in which you feel like you can unconditionally confide in, and will not be judged for it. And name this person, give him a body, give him flesh, make him into an actual palpable person, and then write a letter to this person, uh, as almost a private exercise. Now, don't a lot of these prompts actually go on to become poems that are published, but don't think about the publication aspect of it, because that can come in the way of raw expression. So just someone, first of all, so that's how you translate your helplessness, your anger, into a creative force. So imagine a person, you name him or her or them, and then you channelize everything you have towards that, and you have a dialogue with that person. So what you're essentially doing is you're creating an alternate world for yourself, almost.
Yeah.
And what's more powerful than creating for yourself an alternative world in a world that oppresses you?
Absolutely wonderful. You also said that anger is transformative. Do you think sometimes it can transform us? So, transform us in ways which is perhaps negative. So sometimes anger is the root cause for this emotion called hatred, and I think anger is good and fruitful while it is there, but the moment you actually it gives way to hatred, that's when it becomes blind.
Right. I
And
agree.
do you think that sometimes anger can also be very toxic?
Oh, absolutely. Um, absolutely. So that's another. So there are various kinds of anger, and everyone should keep it in mind. When any emotion, like any other emotion, um, can be very toxic, and can in fact be weaponized by a lot of people and be used as the means to an end.
Absolutely.
It is in fact, uh, dominant political systems do this, right? They incense people and use people's anger as the means to an end. A lot of the time, I see this happening around myself. It happens on social media. Anger is used as a tool of distraction also.
Yeah.
Anger is used as a tool of keeping ourselves away, keeping the people in power tend to use it as a way of keeping the citizens away from what actually matters, and so on. So there are certain kinds of anger that one needs to be very much, and so there has to be a certain amount of. So when you talk about toxic anger and it turning negative, I think that the one way in which we can stop that or stall that is to precisely that, is to sit with our anger and think about where it's coming from or who it's coming from. Is it
Right.
really our anger, or are we becoming vessels for somebody else's anger and then performing that anger as our own?
Absolutely.
And because that a lot of the worst acts. So I read Primo Levi's memoir about living in, and that's a book I would absolutely recommend, before I forget. Absolutely. If This Is a Man, on anger on the worst kind of brutality mankind has perhaps ever been through, and I hope ever go, of being in a Nazi camp for years and years and surviving it and still retaining your anger. Can you imagine being gassed, being treated like animals? I can't even describe it. It's one of those moments in history where language fails, really. Even language fails. But to be able to come out of that and not be benumbed by it, not be transformed by it in a negative way, still retain constructive anger and write books after books about what was he made of, I sometimes wonder.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And so I think one of the way, and what he does is self-reflection.
True.
I mean, is to sit with his anger, to examine whose anger he's carrying, and to look at the people who carried out, the Nazi regime.
Right.
Not all of them were bad people, and that's the irony of it. Not all of they became vessels for a psychopathic person's anger.
Absolutely.
That's what happened. And this is what happens with toxic anger. It becomes infectious, it takes over you in a way that you become secondary to that emotion. Like
True.
you stop mattering, and then it's, like you said, blinding. And then the people no longer even realize what they're doing, and they commit the worst of crimes under the thrall of that. And so, yes, so self-reflection to be able to distance yourself a little bit from your anger, and I keep saying this a lot, to not give anybody the power, to not give anybody the power of how they want you to channelize your anger, because oftentimes it's not about the anger, it's about how you act upon it that really becomes this. So
I
it
have an interest, like I don't know, I have a question there, because I think most of the times why we are embarrassed of being angry is because we're not able, or we haven't learned how to channelize it well. If we are too loud, we run the danger of hurting other people, and we do not want to do that. I think the reason why a lot of us, including me, um, we crawl back into our shell when we are angry is because we do not want to hurt the people who are around us. We do not want to anyone to feel sad just because, hey, I feel very strongly about this particular thing. So when you're channelizing your emotion, you're saying that, hey, this is how you should channelize your anger. I think perhaps sometimes people just want you to express yourself in a way that's not very toxic for the other people around you, that's not very harmful for the other people around you. So if you're saying that do not let anyone tell you how to channel your anger, there might be somebody who likes to come home and beat his wife, and that is sad. So don't you think um, that's a little gray area for us to walk into?
of but yeah, I'll come to that, because that's a whole different topic, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and anger is not the only factor perhaps at play there. There's a whole personality pattern at play there, actually, which I'll touch upon, but like, some people are also incapable of channelizing their anger in the right way, and narcissistic personalities or certain kinds of antisocial personalities are just inequipped, and nothing changes that, unfortunately. It's something that, so which is why when you look at sometimes, everyone's known at least one toxic adult in their lives, or one toxic person. They simply won't change no matter how many times you bring something up. So it's the incorrigibility of it also. And so it's also, if you are unfortunately in a situation in any way, whether it's filial or in an intimate partner situation, or workspace, where a person has these bursts of unhinged anger that they're not able to channelize in the right way, there are chances that you may not be able to correct that. No amount of communication can fix that. And so that's a incredibly hard, extremely hard situation to be in, and I've like full empathy for that. And I'm not sure how that can be changed. It's all about there. It's all about managing your own expectations, and of this technique called gray rocking. But I'll come to all of that later. But it's important. Yeah. So not with I'm talking about like emotionally evolved people who can channelize their anger and can sit with it and can reflect on it, must, because a lot of the times what happens is that even the nicer people, even the more empathetic people get carried away and do things that are actually entirely against the grain of their personality, in moments of anger. And so to recognize how you want to channel your anger and not the anger itself, and giving nobody else the privilege of telling you how you can channelize it, I think is power, is also self-reclamation. In a lot of ways. I look at it as an act of self-empowerment, you know.
Right.
And I think Ocean Vuong says something beautiful about this. I read this in one, I saw it was a video interview I saw, and he said that, and the interviewer asked him, because a lot of his work also, he's again Vietnamese, he's gone through discrimination, has gone through racism, intergenerational trauma, and he said something beautiful. The interviewer asked him, "Don't you feel angry? There's a lot of implicit anger I see in your work," and he said that, "I feel angry, but I express anger from a place of care."
Uh-huh.
It was, and it stayed with me, expressing anger from a place of care, because genuine anger is actually founded very firmly on care. You care about things, which is what makes up a great deal of your anger also. Anger can also come from a place of tenderness. Let's recognize that also. It's not always violent. It can, yeah. um, uh, it can come from something you're very passionate about. It can come from Duende, as Lotka said, which is a very positive kind of energy. So there's that. Now coming back to what you said, which is important, an abusive husband or some such. Unfortunately, there are lots of men like that, and I'm sure it has something to do with the way they were, brought up. It's to do with male privilege. It's to do with the fact that we live in a patriarchal world, and so on and so forth. Men feel entitled to anger, and it's almost also seen as a way of compounding their masculinity, and so it's almost seen as desirable, and
And
that's
I think we should just, for our audience, we should specify it's not, we don't mean all men, because we
of
have,
course, absolutely not
because,
all. Yeah,
we have we sometimes are unfortunate to take one for the entire,
absolutely not.
yeah, but we just are kind of talking about the traditional culture that is kind of,
A larger patriarchal structure. Of course, I mean, having said that, there are also equally abusive women who, anyway, so it's a very complex debate, this complex spectrum, I mean, this one. But like, I think that, speaking in an overarch, of course, not about every man, obviously not, nothing can be a broad statement in that sense, but men generally and over generations have been made to feel more entitled to anger than women, for sure. In men, it's almost also seen as a desirable quality. To see a man on a battlefield getting all angry, and it's seen as a sign of, supremacy, of victory, or a man on the sports field. It's almost dangerously attractive, which is why there are films still made on subjects like these, and they work, unfortunately, all across cultures, because it's seen as,
this is some place that I would like to. So I'm fortunate enough to have some really nice female friends. And when you grow up, you always talk about, hey, I perhaps want to date somebody who does like that. Hey, that character from that place. Or maybe this silent character. And then you grow up and you realize that, hey, perhaps this is not for me. I just want somebody who can hold the temper, her temper, and that is what I want in life. And that is such an underrated quality in people.
tenderness, especially in men. My God, the most attractive quality can be, of just being an unconditional listener. Yeah, but unfortunately, what happens is, because our society is structured in this way, it gives a certain kind of leverage to men over women. There's a certain kind of, you know, uh, of almost entitlement, like I said. Uh, you know, um, Unfortunately, a lot of men, it becomes so ingrained that it's very hard to change. Like, how many abusers change? I don't know of very many people who actually changed, or who, suddenly woke up one day and abusers, I'm talking about abusive men, suddenly woke up one day and started treating their wives with utmost respect and care. Unfortunately, does not happen. It becomes so ingrained. And so in a situation like that, it's like I said, it's therapy. They teach you how to gray rock, which is to literally become a gray rock, so that you don't become a vessel for their anger, because that can be very self-destructive, because they tend to project. Such kinds of men tend to project a lot. Their anger tends to also be projected. They feel insecure, empty, hollow, whatever. They'll project it onto the person closest to them, and so this person then starts feeling that way, etc. So I think it's best to kind of it's impossible. It's very hard, it's easier said than done, I know, but it's so much better to not engage with that anger at all, because you can't have dialogue with it. Any kind of anger that you can't have a dialogue with is best detached.
True. And sometimes I know you can't do anything about it because the kind of anger you can't have a dialogue with is, I mean, you should give up all hopes in that time. But sometimes there's this strong, especially when I was, when you think, when you're in that age where you think, hey, you can single handedly change the entire world, you can through dialogue mend a lot of things, and that is when you start having discussions with people. In fact, even your parents say some certain something that they've learned and they've grown up doing that, and then all of a sudden you're having this conversation with them and you're like, hey, I don't think I your opinion on that particular thing is right, and there comes this anger, and you want to, and in that age, in that time and age, you want to have that dialogue, you want to have that conversation, you want them to see what you are talking about, and you want them to actually listen, value your opinion, and transform. And when that doesn't happen initially, I think I had that phase where okay, I don't think I can talk about it here openly, but there was this particular phase that was happening in the country, and I was having a conversation at home, and I realized in that moment that, hey, there is. It was so frustrating because I know I'm right. This is something we've been taught our entire life in schools, and all of a sudden to see something happen that just preaches the complete opposite of what we've been taught by our teachers, by our books. It was heartbreaking. To have that conversation and be told, no, you're wrong, was all the more heartbreaking. And I think that was kind of the turning point for me, a learning curve, you could call it, where I learned, like, hey, perhaps dialogue cannot always solve everything. I am going to be angry, it's going to be frustrating, I can't do anything about it. But then again, hey, perhaps the best thing right now is to just sit back and relax and let the time take its own course, and perhaps they'll learn it one day when they have to. And perhaps this time it'll be much, much uglier than the conversation we've had.
Very hard to take, but it's also, it takes a great amount. I have to commend you on that. It takes a great amount of courage to be able to reconcile oneself to that, to be able to come to terms with that understanding. So well done on that. And unfortunately, yeah, I think a lot of people may be in this. I know a couple of friends of mine, who have people like that in their lives, where it's almost like there's absolutely no reciprocity in terms of understanding, etc. And it's very hard to sometimes recognize that a lot of abuse is actually only about the abuser and not
Absolutely.
about you at all.
You know what? This is a thing that a few years ago, this is a thought that actually changed the way I looked at relationships. Because I realized when we grew up, as the society in which we live in, we kind of, it's okay for parents to scream at you, to perhaps give you a thappad or two when you're growing up, to insult you, to, verbally abuse you or whatever. We've grown up in an environment like that. And then when you get married, or perhaps when you get into a relationship and your partner abuses you, or physically abuses you, you kind of question yourself, hey, was I wrong? And it's so difficult to get out of it because this abuse in society in general has been normalized, in fact by our own parents. And
Right.
our first instinct is like, hey, how ugly as an individual can I be? And I think the whole struggle for most of the people to come out if they're being abused or if they are suffering because of somebody else's anger is to, like, the whole struggle is like from the moment you've been hurt to the moment where you accept, hey, it's not me, perhaps it's them.
Yeah, and it's so, and you know, this came up in my therapy, and it's very strange that
Yeah.
she said something so profound and so true, which is that sometimes it's with the people that we cannot communicate, and we find that the most difficult to communicate, that we actually try our hardest. There are both kinds of people in our lives. There are people who are unconditionally there for us, who understand us, see us in our worst moments. And
True.
there are people who wall us off, with whom there's no communication that's possible. And unfortunately, 99% of our energies go into those people, into people with whom there is no
It's like the
possibility.
unreciprocated love.
Yes, that's where we try. And so she's like, why look for it in a place where it's
Absolutely.
possible? Revert those, put those energies back, save that, because energy is energy, right? It's raw, whether you're angry or grief or whatever it is. If you save that anger and kind of transform it into something more positive with the better folks in your life, with folks who actually, the better things will come out of that. And that was, yeah, such a wonderful. So why try to keep community? It's sometimes okay to completely detach and to put all your eggs in the good basket, that will
Absolutely.
actually hold it. And ugliness, because you brought that up. I think it's the opening line of Elena Ferrante's The Lying Life of Adults. It's what a brilliant, she's a master of opening lines, right? And the novel opens with the father, the protagonist's father, uh, coming to the mother before leaving the house and saying, I think I don't mangle her words, but mangle his her words, yeah. But he says something along the lines of how ugly my daughter is, and this is right before leaving, and and it's the opening line, and I was like, I was stumped, and I couldn't almost read further, because it was almost like a gut punch of father entering the room to tell the mother that he finds the daughter ugly, and it touched so many chords. I mean, so many inexpressible things. And I've known very abusive fathers. I've known emotionally, I mean, in terms of my observation. And and it was such a brilliant opening line to be able to, address the elephant right in the
Right.
opening line. And so that's also, I think, another illustration of anger. So when she does something like that, she expresses, I think, her own anger of what her father has been to her. Because in that moment, you don't see the father seeing the daughter as ugly. You actually see the father as ugly for actually being disgusted about his own daughter. So that's the level of emotion that she's playing with there. And I thought it was very, very skillful of her to do that.
Nice. I think see, there's this book. This is here, right here, The Velocity of Being. It's by Maria Popova, and she has put in letters by a lot many great authors and writers, uh, and each letter tells you a reason why you should read. And one of them goes that, hey, not everyone will understand you, but every once in a while you'll pick up a book that will make you realize that there are so many people around you, that there are so many people who are just like you, who go through emotions just like you do. And I think over the years, when you grow up, and I think for me it was reading Sylvia Plath. When I was reading her journals, I still haven't completed her journals because I've been trying to finish them since 2018. I can't, because it just gets to me, it hits a lot of chords, and I'm like, okay, maybe this is a good time to stop and be in my safe comfort zone. But the day you discover that, hey, there's somebody, the day you encounter mirroring, where you realize somebody is mirroring you, that's such a profound day. And especially, so like you were saying, like the guy walks in and he says, my daughter is ugly. And when you relate to certain something, you actually realize, you start seeing the patterns. And I think one of the many reasons why reading, I don't think reading or watching angry movies or stuff that's violent or per se is promoted by in general in the society. But I think the reason why reading so much about it, the reason why you should have an understanding of anger, is so that you can navigate around in your life around people. And I think I usually don't talk about this, but I think having met a lot of people, having shared a lot of relationships with people, platonic, romantic, etc., etc., you kind of have your hits and misses. And what the misses teach you is how important those hits are. And for example, having had a series of bad female friendships or male friendships, etc., etc., has made me so thankful for the friends that I have in my life. Because hey, here is an individual you can express your anger to, and they're not going to judge you. They're not going to think like, hey, she has a problem, she likes attention. Here is a person who will adjust to what you're saying. Here's a person who will understand your anger. And then you won't perhaps be embarrassed about it, because then that embarrassment also finds itself in a lot more different emotions. It could lead to a lot of distrust, a lot of insecurity, um, and a lot more. I think you'll be able to better summarize it.
No, I agree. No, and I'm so glad you have people. Everyone should have at least one person, if not more, like that in their lives. And to think about people like these is that when you sit with them and you talk about that emotion itself becomes more profound. That I've also realized that there are certain kinds of anger in which I myself feel very uncomfortable and disgusted. There are kinds of anger that make me feel very small. Or talking about those kinds of anger with people, who may not necessarily understand them, etc. But when you sit and talk about even the most negative of emotions with the right people, they almost call it open for you. It almost becomes like an open wing, a wing of possibility on which you can sail. And that's the beauty. It's not even about someone who can quench your anger. It's about someone who can make it mean something to you or expand it in a profound positive. And I think the right people do that.
True. And I don't know, just like you were saying, you were talking about. I just realized, I think perhaps the most underrated emotion or the most underrating feeling is the feeling of security.
Yeah,
You
I
don't,
definitely
you take it for granted, and the moment it's snatched away from you, or the moment you find yourself in a crowd where you don't know anybody and you're supposed to step out of your comfort zone, that's when you realize how important it is. So a lot of people ask me like, hey, that's my, so I usually am very, so I have a younger sibling, I'm very respectful towards him, and some people do not understand that. And I'm like, hey, like the whole point of having a blood relationship is like, hey, they'll be there for you. But just because it's a blood relationship doesn't mean you need to stop fertilizing it. You always need to take care of a relationship, whether it's a blood relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship, whether you've been friends since you were, what, 2 years of age. And anger, of course, has its negatives, in the sense that sometimes it can weaken a bond. But the moment you realize how to address something, the moment you realize how to contain your anger, like you said, you know how to have difficult conversations. And I think that's very important in life.
totally, totally. And I remember when you wrote to me about this chat, the other two subjects that you mentioned were home and addiction. And it's so strange that they're actually all three, in fact, connected in a lot of ways. Um, Home is actually possibly one of the biggest centers of conflict, of crisis, of the worst possible emotion sometimes. And people don't often recognize that or try to brush it under the carpet, even if they do, because a home is supposed to be this sacred, intimate space, very untouched by anything impure, etc. But So another book that I like to bring up here is Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, again by a Black woman writer. It's actually a play that actually talks about intergenerational conflicts. So there's a grandmother. She has a son. The mother has a son, and then she's a wife, and then there's a kid. So it spans different generations, and uh, it's actually, I read it as a book about a family trying to, and it also gets very complex, because there's a very specific kind of discrimination when it comes to certain communities, and the Black community has been at the receiving end of racism for the longest possible time. And so what happens as a result is that the man, especially, in this case, in the play, starts projecting that onto his wife. And it's strange because he has a different side to him where he's the vulnerable one. It's when he's a driver, he goes out to work, and he has to deal with the worst possible thing. Then he has to deal with the anger of the white men. He comes back home, and he projects that very anger onto his wife, who in turn tries to project that anger onto a child. So I was thinking about that, when you talked about toxic anger, I think home is possibly the first place in which you learn anger. And you learn the ways in which anger is also porous. The ways, you'd like to think of anger as this one singular, very intense, concentrated emotion, but it's actually extremely fluid in the ways in which it flows between different people without even you realizing. It's very dynamic. It's almost like a vehicle moving from one place to another. And so that book, I think, is a great example of that, in case someone wants to. It's also a wonderful book. I'd recommend it.
This reminds me of this play we used to have in class 10 Hindi, Ekanki Book. And the name of the play was Bhatkan. And it is about a family of 4. There is an elder daughter, a younger brother, there are the 2 parents, a father and a mother. And the play is essentially about, and I don't remember what the play is about, but like there's this one particular section where the daughter just randomly wakes up and she's like, why kids run away from house, why we get involved in relationships, why we start having drugs, and we and this is me reading it in class 10, and she's like, it's not because we want to do these things, it's because we want to feel secure, we want to feel loved, we want a safe space where we can be, now that I've learned the word from you, we can be mirrored, and there can be someone who can tell us like, hey, we're similar, we have the same problems, and hey, I'll listen to you. And I think the very notion of finding your safe spot has led a lot of us into discovering things and ending up in situations that we do not want to be in. And some of us were fortunate enough to eventually land a place and a group of people who are very, very nice and fortunate to have us as well. But it is, yeah, self-love. But yeah.
Yeah, and so that's important, because there's the one thing I forgot to mention about that play is that the grandmother has a plant. It's a potted plant. I think it's a begonia. I forget what plant it is, but that plant is almost a character in the play in the number of times it's referred to over. It's almost like a leitmotif. It keeps coming back, and I kept thinking what it actually meant, until at the end, they were about to vacate the house, and and the grandmother said, it's a very important moment. I won't obviously reveal the plot, etc. It's a really important moment. The grandmother says, no, I'm not leaving without that plant. And I realized that, what it possibly meant was a kind of release, is exactly what you were talking about, just previously, is somewhere to some space where you can put down your emotions. That plant was that for her. And anger, especially as it's expressed in this play, is a very destructive kind of anger. And I started thinking about it in terms of my own life. When I look at a plant, it immediately eases me, no matter what state I'm in. It's almost a symbol of possibility for me, and it's a symbol of growth. It's a symbol of creation, and it's a symbol of something that is yet to grow. Further. That's Chen has this beautiful book called "When I Grow Up, I Want to Be a List of Further Possibilities."
Wow.
So, and a lot of people have said this. When I look at my dog, when I look at my cat, or when I look at trees, different people find it in different things. I think there are things that you look at or people you go to that immediately serve as your
Yeah.
places.
This is a question I ask everyone who comes on the channel. Like, hey, what are your pockets of? I've stolen this question from somewhere else. There's this beautiful article by Maria Popova, and she says, "Build your pockets of stillness." And I ask everyone, what is your pocket of stillness? What do you go to when you're feeling uncertain of life? When you're feeling lonely? When you're feeling very emotional? And what are the things that you use to make yourself feel more secure, make yourself feel more grounded? What are those things for you? You were just mentioning them and I cut you off. I'm sorry about that.
No, absolutely not. So walking is a big one for me as well.
Okay.
And especially going on a walk by myself with some music on. I think the reason for that may be that it brings me back into my own body, and that's a big thing. Isn't that sometimes in the worst of my emotions, I suddenly dissociate from my body? It's like lights go off. It's literally like that. There's a fuse that goes off, and then I need to do something that brings me back to the center of my body. I need to feel inside it. I don't even need to have any thoughts in my mind, but I just need to inhabit my skin. That's important. So it's important to do something that's physically slightly stimulating, because just being in your body can be such a liberating feeling, especially for women. I say this for women. So going on a walk, I play the piano sometimes, I listen to music, sometimes run. I talk to plants also sometimes. I like having a conversation with
Yeah, absolutely. I do that a lot.
them. It's very,
I'm kids
yeah,
right now in the balcony.
right. What else do I do? Smell is a big one for me. So like there's always a lavender scent, a jasmine scent, something that suits me immediately. I have like candle scents basically. Those I always have around, and things that I think reawaken my senses in a certain way and refocus them onto the fact that I don't need to turn to the outer world sometimes for abundance, because there's a whole world lying within myself that I've yet to explore. So just bringing myself back to myself.
Absolutely nice. And we'll have to wrap this conversation also, Trivarna, and I'm enjoying this conversation. But I hope you had a good time. But before we go, do you have some final recommendations for us?
In terms of anger or general?
In general, like whatever you think, like all the people who are watching us, what would you like to recommend? Like pick up this thing or watch this thing. It will definitely change your life.
Interesting. Definitely change your life. I always recommend Virginia Woolf, especially Mrs. Dalloway and the Waves. I think one reason is because of what she did with the craft of fiction itself, completely dismantled it. I think I mean, Mrs. Dalloway again is a lot about, what we were speaking about, in our whole conversation about of clinical depression, of PTSD, of someone who has been living with shell shock, etc. And I always find that to be strangely comforting, even though it talks about very disturbing things. And I think that that's because you know truth can be liberating. Sometimes facing reality as it is itself can be your place to offload everything in your oasis. And the other thing that's slightly taboo, but or is considered taboo, is touches upon suicidal instincts, and somehow I've realized that a lot of people, and this should please put disclaimers, trigger warnings, etc. I've seen a lot of people around me at least, mention once or twice that, they no longer feel the will to live, and so on. And that book touches a great deal lot upon what it means to not want to live. And the good thing about what it does is that, usually depression is sort of as a very internal feeling. Am I responsible? I am responsible for what I'm feeling. But that book locates it in the larger worldview of, so Septimus Smith is, and so sometimes we don't even realize that the will to want to live is actually not ours. Perhaps it comes from things that are actually much beyond our control. It comes from medicine. It comes from Virginia Woolf herself had a very, I think, a terrible bout of depression in which she wasn't even treated properly. She was told that she should stop reading, I think, and she was force fed. That's not how you treat depression. I mean, so a lot of insensitivity is actually what leads to suicidal ideation and thoughts, and that's something that is very important for people to recognize, I think. And so to realize, to kind of realize that a lot of it is actually not their burden to bear. The other books that I would, it's actually a short story. Can I recommend a short story?
Definitely. Anything that you want to.
Sonny's Blues. And because you brought up addiction as well, that, when you said change your life, I think that I can't be the same person after reading the story. And I hope that it does the same thing for a lot of other people as well. Because that book stretches your ability to be empathetic. And that's a big one for people who are already empathetic. It's about a jazz musician.
Sorry, what's the name of the title?
Sonny's Blues. Sonny's Blues. Again, by a wonderful black writer, by a wonderful writer, let me say, but of course his blackness has it translates itself into each of his work, and how his, gender identity and his sexuality, homosexual writer. And so it's about two brothers. One of them, the elder one, is a mathematician, and the younger brother, Sonny, is a musician, is a pianist, and he also happens to be a substance addict. And there is a certain lens with which substance abuse is viewed all over the world. It's weirdly moralistic. It's seen as, destabilizing, aggressive, and so on and so forth. But people don't recognize, like you said, is that one needs to have empathy for what the individual might be going through. And his own brother, his elder brother, does not recognize it until he's jailed, by the way. So this is the primal conflict of the story. He's jailed. It breaks his brother, but he also somewhat feels like he deserves it, etc. It's very strange. And he comes back after an year, and this is the most poignant situations there can ever be, and he meets his brother, and that mathematician brother, he sees his brother in his humanity, in his vulnerability, in his supposed flaws. For the first time, he sees him as a human being. And there's a beautiful line where the brother, of course, the mathematician, he says, he no longer sees his addiction as some kind of a monster. He sees it as his want to figure out life on life's terms. And that, I could cry reading. I always cry reading this story, and to figure out life on life's terms, and to be able to see somebody's humanity, and he's come back after a year, and, he's in a very haggardly state, and his brother offers him this glass of scotch, and, and he plays the piano. And it's such beautiful writing. He transcribes every note of what he plays into language. So music is transcribed into language. Every single note. That's empathy for you. I get goosebumps when I read that. Every single note. It's almost like he's transcribing his pulse. And he, for the first time, realizes what his music means to him. Why he possibly resorted to addiction, and he sees him in his humanity. It's and you after that. I think it's very, very hard to not be empathetic to, anybody who's struggling. I think after that story, definitely very transformative. Yeah, so that story. And I think my final literary recommendation would be Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. It's a horror, it's horror fiction. Yeah, it's horror fiction. I love horror, and I think horror can be very transformative, especially well-written horror. It's a book about, and it doesn't have a plot per se. It's very psychological horror. It plays out in the mind, and it's about this woman who faced emotional neglect at the hands of her mother, possibly also her father, if I'm not wrong. But the father is never mentioned anyway. But anyway, so she, there's this offer about, the story is about Hill House, and about how this place is haunted. And so a group of 5 people go into this house to actually see how it's haunted, etc. And, and it's interesting. And she said this woman, Elizabeth, I think her name is obviously one of them. And it's interesting to me how this book is not about external ghosts, but actually about the ghosts that live within us, and about the ways in which ghosts, not as this otherworldly, scary, beings that, come from the other side of life to scare you, etc. But ghosts as very tangible. Ghosts can be people who are alive, people who are there with you in flesh and blood. Ghosts can be people who project onto you, or at whose hands, or who emotionally neglect you. That's a ghost for you, and it's at this place that's supposedly haunted that she begins to process her own ghosts. It's so strangely cathartic. This place is supposed to be haunted and haunting, but it's in this place that she actually finds catharsis, because it's here that she begins to process the unresolved ghosts of her own past, which are very much alive in her life. I won't say very much beyond that, but definitely this book, body horror. The other last book is Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House. Very transformative. I did not know much about lesbian literature. I have to be very frank. This is the first time I discovered lesbian literature, really. And she speaks about, again, going back to anger, etc. She speaks about something that's very important, which is women being abusive to women. And that's very less spoken about for some reason. She was in a relationship with a very abusive woman. So first of all, she says lesbians are not even recognized, even if they're in a happy relationship. And on top of that, if you happen to be with an abusive woman, nobody even sees that, because they don't even consider that as a relationship in the first place. And so there's a lot of levels of abuse going on. And and so it's marginalization from both ends, from a woman, and from the larger patriarchal structure. And she speaks about this very effectively. She writes it as body horror, as a kind of, again, inhabiting a haunted house, a own body becoming a kind of haunted house in this relationship, etc., etc. So anybody who's been abused in a way that they felt that they weren't seen either by their partner or by the people around them, the world around them, I would definitely recommend this book. Film, I have one recommendation. It's this film called Columbus by Kogonada. And I recommend this because I don't think a lot of people have seen it. Like a lot of people haven't even heard of this director. But the reason I recommend it is because it's a very unique take on a man-woman relationship, without giving away too much, because usually, there's this sense of, some kind of like an eternal love, or, romantic. It's not about any of those things. It's about the lines between friendship and love, which I found to be very interesting. I don't know at the end of the film if the protagonists actually loved each other in that sense, or if they were just two people who connected very deeply. And that made me think about something. What is romantic love or intimate love really? What does that label even mean? How is it any different from connecting with somebody on a very intimate level? And that can happen with anybody at any stage in your life, right? So there's lots of blurred lines there, I realized. And sometimes there are romantic relationships in which people don't feel seen. and people can't communicate. And here there was a romantic, it wasn't even a romantic relationship, but unconditional there was an unconditional give and take. So love as a form of connection, love as an unsaid connection, I think, and love as something that does not need to be uttered and said, and love is bound by time, rather than as something that's immortal, etc. I think anyone who's interested in that kind of love, or is exploring the blurred lines between friendship, love, etc., can go to this film. Yeah. I can't hear you any longer, Vaani.
I am sorry, I had muted myself because. But thank you so much for your recommendations. These were absolutely lovely. And I loved this conversation, and I'm a little frustrated with the circumstances that I'm in, and I cannot, and we have to wrap it up. But I would love to have you again. And it was such a fruitful and nice conversation. And I hope a lot of people will somewhere feel connected after the stream and will find a bit of themselves in the words that we exchanged with each other as well. I can't hear you. Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, I can hear you.
Sorry. Absolutely. I said it was a delight. It was eye-opening in many ways. So this conversation itself was very transformative and transportive. And it was a delight talking to you. I also hope that people get something out of this. And I would also love to be on this again if you ever want to have
Yes,
me. I would love
I would love to have you again, over and over again.
I would love to do this here, or otherwise also if you want to talk anytime.
No, definitely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But thank you so much for taking out the time for us. And this was absolutely, absolutely wonderful. And I hope you felt the same.
I definitely felt the same. I think it's in my enthusiasm.
But yes, thank you so much for joining Trivarna. And I hope, guys, you also like this stream. Do follow Trivarna, and we've shared the link in the description also. And if you are not following her as of now on Instagram, you're definitely missing out on a lot of things in life, especially in one particular segment, which is literature. But I hope you guys liked it, and I'll see you again on next Thursday and super soon for the